أهلا وسهلا بحضراتكم كل متابعينا متابعي تلفزيون اليوم السابع في كل مكان في هذه التغطية الحصرية، ويكون مع حضراتكم فيها أنا هشام عبد التواب. منذ أيام اتفاجئ العالم بإعلان فريق طبي أمريكي عن شفاء أول سيدة في العالم من مرض نقص المناعة المكتسبة والمعروف بمرض الإيدز، ذلك بفضل زرع الخلايا الجذعية من دم الحبل السري، وهي تعتبر ثالث حالة على مستوى العالم يتم شفائها من مرض الإيدز منذ الإعلان عن اكتشاف المرض في عام 1983. والحقيقة أنه من وقت ما تم الإعلان عن شفاء هذه السيدة بدأ زميلنا رامي نوار في البحث عن الفريق الطبي المعالج لهذه الحالة. احنا معاكم من هنا من تلفزيون اليوم السابع، بننفرد مع حضراتكم بهذا اللقاء الحصري مع الدكتور مارشال جليسبي. ومارشال جليسبي هو الرئيس المساعد لقسم الأمراض المعدية في كلية طب وايل كورنيل، وعضو الفريق الطبي لعلاج أول سيدة في العالم من مرض الإيدز، وهو بالمناسبة اللقاء الأول له في وسائل الإعلام العربية والمصرية. Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall Gillespie, for being with us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, first of all, we would like to know more about you and the team who worked on the case.
Okay, I'm an infectious disease and HIV specialist at Weill Cornell Medicine. I'm the Associate Chief of our Infectious Diseases Division. I've been conducting HIV research for around 25 years now. And I partnered with my colleagues in oncology here who are experts in doing stem cell or bone marrow transplants. And we participated in a study funded by the National Institutes of Health, which funds most of the biomedical research in the United States, that was really potentially available at multiple sites throughout the country. But in essence, we were the only site that ended up enrolling people into the clinical trial that we'll talk more about.
Can you please give us more information about the first woman to be cured from HIV and how exactly was she cured from HIV?
So let me start out by saying that this is really a unique case. There have been two prior people in the world, both men, who have had similar types of procedures to quote unquote cure HIV. And I can start out by telling you a little bit more about each of them because I think it's relevant to our patient. But I wanted to emphasize up front that this is not an approach that would be something that could be applied to your average person living with HIV infection. It's something that these three particular people, including our patient, underwent because they had a type of cancer that necessitated a stem cell transplant. So the first two people, as I mentioned, were both men. The first person was initially called the Berlin patient, who was an American with HIV living in Berlin, who developed leukemia, a type of leukemia called acute myeloid leukemia, which is the same type of cancer, blood cancer that our patient had, as we'll get to. And his doctor there had a really clever idea, which was to, since he needed a stem cell transplant, to try to identify a donor, an adult donor, who naturally had a genetic variation that made his cells immune to HIV. So it's missing a receptor on the cells that HIV needs in order to enter cells and infect them. And this is something that occurs in less than 1% of people, predominantly people of Northern European descent. So the doctors in Germany found such a donor. The person was treated for leukemia, and the reason a stem cell transplant is done in that setting is in order to try to cure the leukemia, they give very high doses of often radiation and chemotherapy that really wipes out the bone marrow, which is where the blood cells in the body are made. And because of those treatment for the leukemia, if you didn't have a way to salvage the ability of the body to make cells, the person would die because they didn't have the ability to make blood cells anymore. So they get this intensive treatment to kill off the cancer cells, and they get transplanted with cells called stem cells that are very early types of cells that can mature and really manufacture in the body the various types of cells that we need, like red blood cells, white blood cells to fight off infection, and platelets that stop bleeding.
Yes.
So this person underwent that procedure. He actually needed a second transplant, and he got these special cells that were resistant to HIV. And he also had a complication, and sorry to get into all the details of this, but it's relevant for what happened to our patient. He had a complication called graft versus host disease, where the transplanted cells recognize the person's own cells as being foreign. So they attack the cells and can cause damage to different organs in the body. So it was thought that maybe that graft versus host disease was important because it may have killed off some of the cells in the person's body that had HIV in them. So just fast forwarding a number of years, 12 years later, there was not really any evidence of HIV in his body, so he was deemed to be cured of HIV. But unfortunately, he had a late recurrence of his leukemia and ended up dying about 2 years ago now of recurrent leukemia. The second person, often called the London patient, similar type of story, but instead of leukemia, which is a blood cancer, he had a type of lymphoma, which is a type of cancer involving the lymph nodes in the body. And he had a similar type of procedure with similar types of cells. And a few years later, off of HIV therapy, which the first patient also had stopped, there was not really any evidence of HIV reemerging. So our patient was a bit unique in that she was a woman, and that's important because more than half of the people living with HIV in the world are actually women. And she had HIV that was diagnosed. She started on treatment, and then about 5 years later, was diagnosed with leukemia, the same type as the first patient that I mentioned. And she had a high-risk type of leukemia that would be difficult to cure without a transplant. So she underwent the same type of procedure with radiation and chemotherapy and a little bit different type of transplant, which is a unique aspect of what happened to her, in that she got these resistant cells, but they were actually from umbilical cord, meaning a baby was born and the cord cells from the umbilical cord of the placenta were harvested and kept in a freezer. And the nice thing about these types of cord cells, as opposed to cells that come from an adult donor, is they don't have to be matched as carefully to the recipient. So it broadens the number of people who would need if they needed a transplant, who could potentially receive such a transplant. And our patient identified as being as a mixed race, and in general, it's harder to find these types of cells that are resistant to HIV because, as I mentioned earlier, they generally come from people of Northern European background. So she was able to find a match of these cord cells that were resistant to HIV. She got transplanted with those. And because those cells can take a lot longer to start making blood cells in the recipient's bone marrow, she also got stem cells from a living adult relative. And those were not the kind that were resistant to HIV, but they were enabled her body to start making blood cells faster. And in fact, she was able to leave the hospital after about 17 days. And then by 100 days, we documented that the stem cells from the umbilical cord had really taken over, the ones that were resistant to HIV. And 100% of the blood cells in her body were derived from this umbilical cord stem cells, which were resistant to HIV. So she waited.
To try,
Go ahead.
Try to understand more about what you're saying, it's meant to be curing the cancer, but it was like curing the HIV. Is that what happened to the woman?
Yes, basically all three of these people, including the woman that we've been talking about, it's like the expression we would use is killing two birds with one stone, meaning treat the leukemia and cure the leukemia, hopefully cure the HIV with this transplant.
So do we have a cure now for HIV? Yes.
So we I didn't mean to say yes to that to answer the question. It's an excellent question, is what I should say. We have proven, I think, with these three cases, and one thing about our case is she didn't have that graft versus host disease, meaning the cells that she received did not attack her own cells. And we've demonstrated, so she stopped her HIV medicines a few years after the transplant, and 14 months later still has no evidence of HIV. So we hope that she'll be cured. We're maybe not quite ready to use that word right now, but she's at a minimum in long-term remission. So this would not be something that could be done for your average person with HIV, and there's over 30 million people in the world with it, because it's a procedure that can actually cause a lot of complications and even death up front. So about 20% of people who undergo a transplant like this could either die or have very, very serious complications. So it's not something that we would do for someone who doesn't need transplant like this to try to cure something like leukemia.
You mentioned stem cells. Can we consider stem cells as the magical treatment for many diseases, especially after announcing the first man who was cured from diabetes using stem cells?
Well, I think there's a lot of potential for stem cells to be used to treat a number of different diseases. And that's because they have the ability to really turn into other types of cells. So in our case, it was the red blood cells and the white blood cells that fight off infection and the platelets that clot the blood. But potentially stem cells could be used to try to regenerate or kind of build up other organs in the body if they are somehow driven to form other types of cells. So I think there is potential. In our case, again, it was a unique situation because she had leukemia and needed the transplant. This, again, would not be something that could be done broadly to other people who don't need such types of transplants. One extension of this, though, and there are research groups and companies working on this, is can you take a person's cells and genetically engineer them to be these types of resistant cells, like the ones that were transplanted into our patient, and infuse them back into the person with HIV and hope that those cells would take over and enable the person to stop their HIV medicines. We're a ways from doing that for sure, but it's the cases like our case, I think, give hope that this approach, that type of approach, where you do this without an actual chemotherapy, radiation, transplant, but in a different way through genetic engineering, that this perhaps could be a way to manage the diseases like HIV in the future.
So after these amazing results, what's next? Will you do any observation on the patients that you have already worked on their cases? You will be including new patients diagnosed with HIV. What's next?
Well, the study that our patient enrolled into is not enrolling any additional people at this point, but our goal would be that if we had someone, either one of our own patients or someone who was referred to our medical center who has HIV and needed a transplant because of something like leukemia or certain types of lymphoma and blood cancer or cancer of the lymph nodes, if they needed it, then we would see if we could identify cells that are a good match, that have this genetic variation that make them resistant, and try to really replicate what happened to our female patient. We will be following her over time just to make sure that the HIV stays under control, and undoubtedly we'll be doing other studies just to evaluate that.
So again, yes, Dr. Marshall, again, what is your message to all the patients who were diagnosed with HIV? Do we have hope in the future that they will be cured from this virus?
Well, first off, let me just say that people with HIV, most people, a very, very high percentage of people, can lead relatively normal lifespans now with the effective medications we have to treat the virus. So people who are able to access these medications and take them regularly, and for many people it can be as simple as one pill once a day. Many of these medications, have few side effects. So therapy is quite good, and we do expect people to lead lifespans that we think are, will be pretty comparable to someone without HIV. There may be other complications that are more common in people with HIV, like heart disease or aging-related problems. But nonetheless, there's a lot of research, in those areas to try to reduce those risks. I think our patient and the other two preceding patients that I mentioned do give hope that the efforts that are being undertaken in many laboratories, many research groups throughout the world to try to develop a cure for HIV, that there really should be hope that this someday will be achievable. We're
Yes.
a ways from that now, and it may be that multiple different types of things may need to be done in order to achieve a cure, but there is a lot of research funds being devoted to this, and research groups at our center, at Weill Cornell, and really throughout the world are working very hard on trying to develop a cure for HIV.
Yes, you said someday, but to put that in a time frame, when exactly can we have this experiment to be applied widely?
Well, again, if you're referring to what happened with our particular patient, I don't think that would be something that would ever be applied widely. But what I was talking about just a moment ago, all the research efforts being done in laboratories throughout the world, the hope is that at some point that some of these different approaches will either be combined or individually could lead to cure for many people with HIV. I can't really put a time on that. There's been remarkable progress made in the field of HIV. Really, the condition was first recognized in 1981. The first cases of AIDS were recognized. The virus was discovered a couple of years later, 1983. So it's really just been a few decades, and we've made remarkable progress over that time period. If you compare it to many other diseases, we obviously don't have cures for many types of cancer. We don't have cures for many other diseases. So we're making great progress, and I don't think it's something that's a year away or 2 years away, but I am hopeful that we'll get there someday.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marshall Gillespie, for being with us and for all the information. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
بنشكر شكرا جزيلا الدكتور مارشال جليسبي الرئيس المساعد لقسم الأمراض المعدية في كلية طب وايل كورنيل وعضو الفريق الطبي لعلاج أول سيدة في العالم من مرض الإيدز وصاحب بالتأكيد هذا الإنجاز العلمي الكبير. كان معانا في هذا اللقاء الحصري على تلفزيون اليوم السابع. بنشكر حضراتكم بالتأكيد على متابعتنا وبنشكر بالتأكيد زميلنا رامي نوار على إعداد هذا اللقاء. شكرا جزيلا لحضراتكم. كنت معاكم هشام عبد التواب وإلى اللقاء.